Yes, welcome back to Hawkbinge, your guide through the astral plane that is the Hawkwind discography, one album at a time, in the company of a long-time fan, which is me, and your regular first-time listener, which is Matt in New York. How are you doing, Matt?
Hey Andy, I'm doing really well. I've moved finally, so I'm in a
Yay!
place where hopefully the sound is a lot better. At least I have a desk, so I can put my microphone on a desk and not have to hide under a duvet.
Yes, I'm rather missing the cosmic duvet of broadcasting.
I know it looks less spacey and vibey in here. However, it does look a lot more professional. I have hopefully not a lot of echo. We shall see. I need to work on that. But yeah, I'm in Williamsburg now. I only moved maybe half a mile really, but in New York terms, that can be across the city. So I'm in a place where I have an extra room, so I can turn it into a little bit of a studio, which is fantastic. We'll see because I have neighbours now, and also I'm on a busier street, whether or not that's now a noise problem. But for now, I'm going from the desk up and things can only get better.
Excellent. And it's been a long time.
I guess it has. The problem is, whenever I keep saying happy whatever to you when we do this, is that I date these really hard. What you can normally do as well is date how long it has been between when I record it and when I finally get around to finishing editing it. So I should probably stop doing that. But yes, it has been a little bit of a time. Like I said, the move was obviously a thing. And obviously
Yep.
packing stuff up means that you have to pack up equipment, and then I was in a whole space which is obviously so echoey it wasn't really gonna work out. And I guess you've been busy as well.
Yeah, we both had some kind of monster projects with some rather crushing deadlines and tried to do this last weekend and I cancelled. I was trying to learn some lines for a big presentation and I didn't think kicking off that presentation with Welcome to Hawkbinge, your guide through the astral plane that is the Hawkwind discography, would have gone down too well with my employers. So we will try to do these in a more timely fashion. And there is some Hawkwind news. There is a new Hawkwind album. So your prediction that they would bring out new albums faster than we record episodes has been borne out. So I'm quite excited about that. You obviously can't listen to it because we don't cross the streams.
I know this is oddly frustrating now. I kind of want to check it out.
I worked out at our current rate of recording, we would actually finish the 34 studio albums in about 2.5 years' time. In which time, I suspect Hawkwind will release at least 3 new albums.
Yeah, that sounds altogether possible. So we need to either get our recording rate up, or we need to find a way to somehow cripple the Hawkwind band somehow using our minds. But I feel like probably just recording faster would be an easier task.
Yes, there's got to be a way. And we have another announcement to make because we have joined the Deep Dive Podcast Network, which is all very exciting. And the Deep Dive Podcast Network is just a community of people who really love doing these kinds of podcasts, diving into albums and bands, and kind of just come together. Basically, it's not a commercial enterprise in any way. But there are some great ones out there that we've joined in with now. So there is a Deep Purple podcast called the Deep Purple Podcast with Nate and John. The Simple Man runs the Skinnerd Reconsidered podcast, if you're a Leonard Skinnerd fan, and that is one of the great podcast titles, I think. Terry T-Bone Mathley has T-Bone's Prime Cut, which is a great one. Rye has the Sabbath Bloody podcast for all your Black Sabbath needs. That was my introduction to the Deep Dive Network. They're great. I've heard all of those. Paul, Joe and David at the Lap of the Pods, which is a Queen podcast. Scott has a Uriah Heep podcast called the Magicians Podcast. And there is a new member. We are no longer the complete newbies to the Deep Dive Podcast Network. There is an Iron Maiden podcast, Maiden AZ Pod from Sweden. So that should be fun as well. So if band histories and album stories are your thing, and they very much are mine, then there is plenty at the Deep Dive Podcast Network for you. And we've made some good new friends there. So we're pretty happy to be part of that. So we have a couple of letters in the post bag. Again, people have been kind of sending quite long emails, basically about their own Hawkwind experiences, and that's very, very cool. We got one from Rick Evans. Hello, Rick, if you're out there.
In sunny LA as well.
In sunny LA, yes, indeed, which makes me feel somewhat jealous. So he mentioned that we were talking about musical serendipity. You know, you're kind of thinking about a band and put them on, and then they announce a tour or an album or something. And that's what happened with us, with him. He was thinking about a Hawkwind podcast, and there we were. So great to hear from you, Rick. And we had another one from Rob Crow only last week, who says that our podcast makes his bus journey to work bearable. So that must be the mother of all hellish bus journeys if we're making that bearable. And he's very cool with what we're doing, and he talks about how he listens to Hawkwind, which is really interesting. Actually, he takes in Hawkwind through compilations exclusively. So his first couple of Hawkwind albums were compilations, and he really likes the compilations. That's how he does it. I'm definitely more of an album person. I quite like the kind of narrative journey through an album and its kind of highs and lows and the rest of it. But it struck me that Rob's actually ahead of the game, because he's kind of like part of the playlist generation. Compilations are kind of one band playlists, aren't they? So he's kind of in with the new, and I'm stuck in my old ways.
I think I might end up being more of a Rob Crow than a you when this is finished, just because I feel like, at least with a lot of the albums that we've talked about, there are enough speed bumps that I would be quite happy to probably nix. Although, like you said, going back to seeing an album and remembering that there are ones that sometimes that you do skip on does mean that sometimes it is nice to play it in its entirety to remind yourself that these things do exist. However, just for a bit of instant gratification, I can always see a best ofs being the kind of thing that you might reach for.
Absolutely. There is a Twitter account that I recommend to everyone who have been kind of having the odd chat with, who is 33 1/3 Revolutions. And he has collected Hawkwind cuttings and reviews and posters and things since the days themselves. So he posts on Twitter like a Melody Maker review of Hawkwind, like from the time that an album was released, and all these different cuttings and things, which is fascinating. I'm much more interested in reviews at the time than this kind of retrospective, oh, that was a great album, I better say it was a great album kind of reviews that you tend to get these days. So he's kind of got a veritable Hawkwind museum that he posts every now and again on Twitter, which is great fun to look through. So there's that one as well.
That sounds very cool. Although the fact that I'm doing reviews right now does sound like that was a side eye at my contribution to this podcast.
But the beauty of your reviews is that you have no idea of the status of the thing that you're reviewing.
I see. So the blissful ignorance is fine. That gives me a caveat. Okay.
Your reviews are kind of a modern version of the original reviews when the albums came out, because you haven't got lots of other people's reviews to copy.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, I feel a lot more better about life now. Thank you.
That's good, because I wouldn't want to insult you like to your face.
You'd wait till I was several thousand miles away.
Exactly that. So Matt, in the interim, since last we spoke, all those many years ago, what else have you been listening to?
One of the interesting things that happened from last time when we were talking about live albums was that one of my favourite artists of all time dropped a live album, which is very cool because I've always wanted to try to find a way to get him into one of the recommendations, and this seemed a really great way of doing that. The artist is a composer called Niels Frahm. He's a German composer. He's very eclectic in terms of what he produces. He does produce albums, but he also does soundtracks. He also does soundscapes. He's a very modern composer, but I think he has a lot of very classic training and sensibilities in the way that he works. But his live shows are quite spectacular. This album that he's released is called Tripping with Niels Frahm, and it covers the last 18 months of him doing his All Melody album, which went all over the world and began and finished in Berlin, where he played at the Funkhaus, which is a glorious, almost cathedral-like building with amazing acoustics and looks gorgeous. The whole set is available to stream as well as the album, so it is really cool to look at. And it's essentially him with 3 or 4 stacks of a mix of vintage equipment, very modern equipment, loopers, echo machines, and he just runs between all of them, making them do things in a way that I kind of feel like a musical plate spinner might. So creates something, lets it loop, runs over, jams on this like really broken piano that has a gorgeous echo to it, runs over to like a really old synthesizer that he found in a shed, makes that sound really gorgeous. The whole thing is atmospheric and lovely, and there's not a single time when I can't listen to that without just feeling like taken away. 2 times when I have seen him live, and the recording is really faithful. So I think that's really gorgeous. The album is called Tripping with Niels Frahm by Niels Frahm. The track that I would select for our playlist is called All Melody.
Sounds awesome. I'm an appreciator of Niels Frahm, so definitely going to look out for that one. Anything else?
Yeah, another take on live music is that over the last few years, I've been getting into modular synthesis as a way of trying to play with music myself. I wouldn't call myself a particularly musical person in terms of like being able to play the piano or the violin or anything, but I listen to a lot of music. I have a lot of music. I have DJed before. I've done some studio engineering work. So I'm kind of in that world a bit. And modular synthesis I do really like because it seems to be an interesting mix of generative music and engineering that I can get my head around. Like if you put me in front of a keyboard, I'll panic. But all these like knobs and wires and things that you can plug in together and use electricity to make other parts of a machine work is actually very compelling to me.
You're kind of a modern Dick Mick.
Maybe it might be the thing that has helped draw me into some of the stuff, especially as we've got further through the albums and it's become more apparent and more creatively interesting for sure. So when I got to New York, I found that there was a New York Modular Society that have a like a Discord and a website, and they chat a lot, but they also do shows. And one of the shows that I went to is one of the last things I saw before everything got locked down. And it's been really interesting the last 14 months when everyone has been locked down, especially I found in this sector of music. But a lot of people who used to perform haven't been able to, but they haven't stopped. They've gone on Twitch, they've gone on YouTube, they've gone on Instagram, they've bought lots of different camera arrays to the point where 14 months later, people are doing shows online which are as captivating and as amazing as going to a show, minus like the volume and the fact that like other people are around. But they're worth watching. You know, before it was like one person with a GoPro that was probably slightly out of focus, and you're like, well, this is fine, but it's not really as good as it could be. So the Neo Modular Society every Thursday do a drop where people come and play. And last Thursdays there was a new person who I'd never heard of before. I think it's pronounced Itai. It's Iitaii, and he played a set entirely modular and his own voice. And he had a light show. He had at least 3 different camera angles. The sound was incredible. Wow. The mix was gorgeous. It really felt like someone was like at the front of a show recording, but like he was cutting around. It was like a full performance, and I was so captivated by just the dedication it's taken for people to really want to still do a show even when you're not around and contribute to this little society and little faction of music. So I thought it was very cool. As soon as I saw his set, I dove into his catalogue. He hasn't produced a lot, but the stuff that he does is really nice. It's a little industrial. It's a little like old school Fear Factory, but there's also a lightness to it, and the vocals are more like kind of sonorous compared to like a screamy kind of thing. And I have been listening to his album Zeros and Twos, which is on Turntable Records. The track which I've been listening to a lot and will recommend for the playlist is also called Zeros and Twos.
Amazing. That sounds pretty epic. I definitely look forward to that. I do love a bit of modular synthesis myself. That's cool. Very good. And of course there is a new sessions playlist coming your way. The previous one is already up there. We'll talk about where you can get hold of that later.
What will you be adding to this, Andy?
I've been spinning a few things actually, but the 2 things that really stand out, there's something old and something new. And the something new is very relevant to Desert Fest, which we've talked about before. And obviously the lineup for Desert Fest 2022 was released, and we both have tickets to the whole thing, and that looks great. But it reminded me of Samsara Blues Experiment, who we saw at the first Desert Fest playing in the Purple Turtle, like this tiny pub. And they've released an album called End of Forever on Electric Magic. It's a brilliant album, and sadly it looks like it's their final album. They've announced that they're going on an indefinite hiatus. So they've given themselves an out in future if they suddenly decide to do it again. But basically, this is the final album, which I'm gutted about. They're not one of those bands where you'd introduce them to someone new by saying, oh, play the first one or the second one first and then kind of get into the rest of it. For me, they actually get better and better with every new album. And this new one is no different. It's just excellent. Kind of psychedelic rock. It's hard to describe, but anyone who's really into Hawkwind and that desert scene vibe, I think, is going to find plenty on here. The track I've picked is Second Birth. It's pretty long. It's the opening track. But if you like that, then you will like all of the rest of what they do at Samsara Blues Experiment. Brilliant German band, and be very sad if that is in fact the last thing that they do. Well worth checking out.
That is a solid recommendation. The first time we saw them, they were maybe like early or middle of the day, and I think they were pretty new, and everyone was blown away by it. And then by the next Desert Fest, they were headlining the Underworld, right?
That's right, yeah, and that was fantastic when they headlined Underworld. I can't remember the band that we didn't go to see in order to see Samsara. Someone was headlining at the Roundhouse.
But it was Red Fang.
It's always Red Fang. So we saw Samsara, and yeah, they were fantastic, three-piece. So definitely check that one out. The other one is interesting because I listen to them all the time, so it's no great surprise that I'm listening to them now. But that is that a Black Sabbath album, and it's one of those periods where there just seems to be a lot of Black Sabbath news and articles and things doing the rounds. I thought it might just be that I'm into Black Sabbath, so the way the internet works, you just end up deluged by the things that you've told the internet you like. But there are several Sabbath podcasts, nothing quite as good as Sabbath Bloody Podcast, obviously, Rye, with the OG of Black Sabbath podcasts. But there are several others, and they're kind of coming out, they're all relatively new, and it's really interesting. So it just makes me kind of go back and listen to it, and as people are going through albums and the history of it, kind of evaluate where I come from with that. The Black Sabbath and Hawkwind are probably my two defining bands in terms of kind of my life. Although we both like a massive range of things, those two definitely stand out. When I got into Sabbath, it was in the Tony Martin era, which was like in the kind of 80s and 90s. That's the age I was at the time. But collected all the other albums, but saw them with Tony Martin and later with Dio, and then later obviously with Ozzy many times, including with Your Good Self, basically on the reunion tours. So I've got a lot of love for those kind of Tony Martin Dio albums. I think they're great. And, you know, those are the times when I saw them. But the Ozzy era for me just kind of is on a pedestal simply because in that 70s period, they weren't conforming to anything. There weren't any rules. There wasn't a genre. They were just playing what they wanted to play and inventing and experimenting. There's an orchestra, or there's a choir, or a French horn or flutes or something. And it just because that's what they want to do, that's what suits what they're going to play. And there's a point they reach, I think, where the experimentation is more born out of a desperate need to try and find a place in a music industry which is moving away from them. And it suddenly becomes more about kind of commercial discussions about where they fit. And then by the time you get to the 80s, then you kind of have the language of heavy metal has kind of been defined. You know, you kind of wear black leather and you give signs of horns and you have fancy lyrics. And it's very much a metal band lineup. So I still love that stuff. I still think that's excellent, that music. But the 70s albums, for me, where they're just being completely transformative as a band and just being true to who they are. And you see the early pictures, they're not wearing black. They're kind of wearing jumpers and, you know, brown trousers and things. It's just very weird. And the album that typifies that for me is Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, which is probably alongside Master of Reality, my favorite album. The track I've picked is Spiral Architect. So any Sab heads out there will recognize that. And it's the kind of thing I don't think you hear anything like from Sabbath, basically once the 70s period is over. So that's the one I've gone with. Those are the two tracks for me. Second Birth by Samsara Blues Experiment, Spiral Architect by the Mighty Sabs, that will find their way into the next Hawkbinge Sessions playlist.
That's interesting. I actually don't know as much about Black Sabbath as I probably should, so I will definitely be listening to that. I'm a kind of a victim of Sabbath being the archetypal band that you would mention when you mention that kind of music, and then like Ozzy, I guess, becoming like a cult figure and then kind of spearheading a whole genre of MTV shows and all that kind of stuff means that I've never really got into them as much as maybe I should have, but this will give me a good reason to correct that oversight.
Excellent, and I'm sure Rye will therefore be expecting a new subscriber sometime soon. Right, so let us dive back in to 1974 and the kind of musical period in which Hall of the Mountain Grill was released. So what's astounding in 74 is that there's a number of bands that released 2 albums this year, and I'm constantly amazed at this, simply because, you know, now you kind of get an album every 3 years or so from most bands. And it kind of occurs to me, if you had 2 albums worth of material in the bag, you could basically skive off for a good few years. But there's a number of bands that do it here. And Grand Funk Railroad won up everyone by releasing 3 albums, which is slightly ludicrous.
That's like a Grand Funk Central Station.
I mean, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard released 5 albums in a year, like only about 3 or 4 years ago, like as a project. And that's like most bands' career is 5 albums.
That was exhausting. I feel like somewhere between 1 and King Gizzard is probably your sweet spot.
Yeah, exactly. So Grand Funk released Shining On, The Locomotion, and Walk Like a Man. But the bands that release 2 albums are ones that are kind of well known and of interest to our Deep Dive Podcast Network partners. So Queen released Sheer Heart Attack and Queen 2. Deep Purple released Stormbringer and Burn, which is the Coverdale period, I think, of the band. King Crimson, Starless and Red, 2 absolutely incredible albums, and then they go on hiatus for 7 years, so it was all too much for them. Brian Eno releases Here Come the Warm Jets and the amazing Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy. Frank Zappa, the great Frank Zappa, Apostrophe and Rocks in Elsewhere, 2 amazing albums. So there's a lot of bands releasing 2 albums. There are 2 albums released by a band called Foghat, Energized and Rock and Roll Outlaws. And I mention that only because I find the word Foghat really pleasing to say. And it also reminded me of Puss Hat, which I think we need to relay this story. Matt and I went to the Temples Festival in Bristol, which was like a doom metal festival. And there was a poster on the wall advertising a forthcoming concert by rapper Pusha T. Pusha, P-U-S-H-A. And the name Pusha T wrapped around a semicircle at the top of the poster, which means you get this point at the top of the semicircle where one letter leans to the left and the next letter leans to the right, creating a gap and making it look like 2 words. And the 2 words were Puss and Hat. So Puss Hat became what Pusha T actually was to us thereafter.
And considering that we were at Temples, that would have been a much more appropriate band to be playing.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. So there's some phenomenal stuff released in 74, as you can imagine. It's a real kind of crossover, it feels to me, between like the early 70s and the sounds that would come to dominate later. And there's also a time here where things show up and you go, oh, that's where that comes from. So Jolene by Dolly Parton is released in 74. Tangerine Dream released Phaedra. The first Kiss album comes out, so they're going to be around for a little while.
Phaedra being probably the first time that I put on a record of my dad's when I was a kid and was just so confused that I just like I don't think I was upset, but I was just like, you know, when something happens or you get a bit of news and you just can't process it. It was so different to anything that was like on the radio or anything I'd been listening to before that I just couldn't deal with it. And I do. So now Phaedra, that crazy font and that album and everything is seared into my mind as a complete point of both like having my awareness of music forcibly expanded almost against my will, and therefore it causing a lot of internal craziness in my brain.
So we're having flashbacks now.
Exactly. As soon as I hear that, I'm like, oh my god, I'm 8 and I don't understand what's going on. Help!
Also in 74 is the remarkable Autobahn from Kraftwerk. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, the last Gabriel album with Genesis. You get Sheet Music by 10cc, Mr. Natural by the Bee Gees. Bowie releases Diamond Dogs. And If You Love Me, Let Me Know by Olivia Newton-John, which again is kind of a sign of what's coming. Rock-a-Roller by Judas Priest, again, who are going to become kind of a big force in metal. Thrust by Herbie Hancock, which is kind of his funky kind of jazz stuff. Planet Waves by Bob Dylan. Wonderworld by Uriah Heep, so the Heapsters out there will love that one. Neil Young releases On the Beach. Natty Dread by Bob Marley, big kind of influential album there. And there are albums from Traffic, Carole King, Jethro Tull and the Stones. Something that made me laugh, Remember Me This Way, a live album, is released by Gary Glitter, which is amusing because that is not the way that we remember Gary Glitter. And 1974 is also the year that Wish You Were Here is released. Now, just before all of the listeners there rush to Twitter to abuse me, it's Wish You Were Here by Badfinger, not Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd, which of course does not come out in 1974. So that is 1974 in music. This is kind of the era that Hall of the Mountain Grill comes out in. These are the albums that it's broadly competing with. So what is Hawkwind's state as they go into the studio to record Hall of the Mountain Grill? Well, it's kind of an interesting one. We're about 2 years on from the last studio album. They've done the whole Space Ritual thing in the middle. They've been selling a lot of records. Space Ritual itself was a top 10 album, which is amazing. They've got some money. And kind of as you think with bands, they get a bit of money and it kind of messes with them a little bit. I think there's some evidence that they're not entirely comfortable, although they're very comfortable kind of financially and going in nice hotels and flying everywhere and all the rest of it. But their kind of outsider status and counterculture status is slightly rattled by this. And I think there's also a sense of them trying to move on from the Space Ritual. They do a tour of the States under the banner of the Ridiculous Roadshow with the Silly Hawkwind brothers, which is about as far removed from Space Ritual as you can possibly get. So it's an interesting time of a little bit of turmoil, perhaps, which we'll come to. The lineup has changed slightly as well. We still have Dave Brock and Nick Turner. Lemmy is still playing the bass. Simon King on the drums. Del Detmar is still playing synthesizers, though he will leave at the end of this album. But new in the band is Simon House, because Dick Mick has now left. And Simon House comes into the band, and he plays violin and mellotron. Based on, if you're not familiar with mellotrons, that kind of lush wall of sound strings that you get, that's the mellotron. And it's fair to say, I think, that Simon House is all over this album. And I actually have a quote here. So I've got 2 books now that I read through. Everyone knows how much I love the Joe Banks book, Hawkwind Days of the Underground. It's a brilliant book, but it's also reading the chapters of a book that kind of corresponds to the era that we're covering and the album that we're covering means I can read more than one at a time. So I'm not reading them cover to cover. And that has led me to pick out Sonic Assassins by Ian Abrahams. And they're very different books. Joe Banks' book is almost a period in history through the lens of Hawkwind and Hawkwind's kind of part in it. Ian Abrahams' book is an incredibly solid band history. So buy both is basically the message here. But it's interesting that Simon House, he's actually a trained musician. And of course, Hawkwind have rather played up their lack of trained musicianship in everything that we've heard from them so far. And Nick Turner says of Hall of the Mountain Grill, this is a quote from Ian Abrahams' book, Sonic Assassins, quote, Turner saw Hall of the Mountain Grill being complex, more sort of musical, as he told Jeff Barton in Sounds magazine. That's the influence of Simon House as a musician and in his personality. So you can see that Simon House actually makes quite a big difference to the band. It's also interesting to me that in being as present in the music that he is another sign of Hawkwind very much kind of embracing and absorbing whatever someone new brings to the band rather than having some kind of set formula for what they do. So Hall of the Mountain Grill is released in September of 1974 and it gets to number 16, which is, you know, again, not just respectable, that's still a big album, particularly in those days to get to number 16. So no let up basically in the Hawkwind story with Hall of the Mountain Grill. So that's where the band are. That is Hall of the Mountain Grill. That is 1974. We're going to go to Matt's hot take, but there's a couple of things to pick out here first. Hall of the Mountain Grill is a massive milestone album for me personally because it was my first Hawkwind album. And so actually I heard this album in the same way that Matt listened to the first Hawkwind album with no context. I had no idea who Hawkwind were or anything about them when I heard Hall of the Mountain Grill. And I just wanted to talk about that just for a little bit, just for a bit of context really. So when I was younger, I was quite ill, so I didn't really get out much. I wasn't particularly savvy of the world. I didn't have any particular view of fashion or bands or anything that was out there. It was very insular. My brother, who's 2 years older than me, was quite the reverse. He was into everything when it first came out. He saw the Beastie Boys on their first tour, the Specials when they came out. He was a little young for punk, but he was kind of influenced by it. He was very much into bands like Clash and The Jam, but he was also into the Beatles, and he liked a bit of Status Quo, and we both liked Frank Zappa. But he was very keen on expanding my musical horizons. But rather than pushing his music onto me, he would pick out things that he would think that I'd like and then kind of encourage me to get into it. which was kind of an amazing thing, really. And I was engulfed in science fiction. I just read voraciously science fiction. We're talking about Asimov, DKD, Arthur C. Clarke, all this kind of stuff. When I was young, I read so much of that. And he came up with a couple of albums on a birthday of mine. Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced? First Jimi Hendrix album. And Hawkwind, Hall of the Mountain Grill, which we'll get to later, really, the kind of a cover which is a bit like the cover of a science fiction book. Because he thought that I would be into this stuff. He was encouraging when I was listening to, was starting to get into Black Sabbath and these kind of things. He got me King Crimson compilation that got me into King Crimson. So he got me Hall of the Mountain Grill, and young me would have put that on. And I can remember the scene, basically, and you hear the psychedelic warlords disappear in smoke, which is a really evocative title. You've got that science fiction cover, and that was kind of me hooked. I had no idea who they were, basically, and then I went on a rampant collection spree of whatever random Hawkwind albums I could find from the different eras. And that's my introduction to Hawkwind. So it's still a favourite album for me, spoiler alert, but this is more about Matt's reactions than mine. And that first track still kind of gives me goosebumps a little bit because I can remember that feeling of first hearing it. The only other track that's ever had that effect on me was the first time I ever heard Sabbath. So those two things are really going together. So that's me and Hall of the Mountain Grill. I am therefore horrifically biased, clearly, but that's my role on the podcast, is to be horrifically biased.
If there was two people who didn't know Hawkwind talking about Hawkwind, this podcast wouldn't make a lot of sense. So I'm very glad that you are actually massively into them.
On that note, as we get to your hot take of Hall of the Mountain Grill, I thought it'd be interesting just to see what your process for listening to these albums is, basically, because it's certainly not that a few days before the pod, you put the album on, give it a couple of listens, decide whether you like it or not. You've kind of got a bit of a process, haven't you?
Yeah, it's born out of the fact that you take this very seriously. I don't want to waste the time of people who are listening, and I want to make sure that I do a good job as someone who is coming in new, because you feel like you could make a huge bunch of errors or a huge bunch of statements which people massively disagree with. So I do feel in the 2 weeks, ideally, that we do between each episode, I try to become as into the album as possible in order to give a kind of a counterpoint or a critique or a accompaniment to your experiences. So the things I do, I kind of have a 3-step process, which I call familiarize, detail, and vibe. So I actually listen to each album on 3 different sound sources, depending. So the familiarize part of this is listening to it as much as possible and just remembering what the tracks are, where they start and stop, and just getting to know the lyrics and the general feel of the tracks. I tend to do that on a pair of Apple AirPod Pros while walking the dog, because that's a great time when I have some alone time, and I can spend a good hour trying to wear him out as we go for our walk, so I can make sure I get the whole album out. The detail part of this is that I switch to a pair of III TMA2 HD monitoring headphones, and I do find the fact that they are hardwired into a system, and I can listen to the whole album on an FLAC codec. So it brings out details which I definitely don't hear on the AirPods. So that's when I can do my detailed listening, and that's when I make most of my notes in terms of what I'm really hearing, things I pick out, themes that I'm listening to, because that is when I'm doing a lot of my focused listening to it as deep as possible, often with my eyes shut, unless I think of something worth writing down. And the last one for vibe, which I have kind of been dinged on a few times by a couple of comments where people don't seem to think I do this, but maybe it's just the way I come across. But I then make sure that at least a few times I put the album cover really big on my monitor. I turn all the other lights off. I put the album through a pair of Klipsch, the 6's monitor speakers, as loud as I can, and try and have like a pint of something while I listen to it. And try not to listen so much as just feel it and try and understand where they might be going just in terms of the sound. Because the one thing I have found with this is that with a lot of these albums, the louder you play them, the more they kind of cohere, which is weird, because I feel that if you listen to them at a low volume, you miss more because it feels more fractured, but actually it seems to come together more at higher volume. So I do make sure that I try and listen to it a few times as the band intended, even though I'm obviously in a apartment block in the middle of Williamsburg and don't want to get attacked with brooms by my neighbours. But I can normally do that 2 or 3 times before I get to do it. So yeah, familiarize detail and vibe is what I try to do to get as up to speed as possible with the albums.
That's pretty epic. That vibe bit, I really want to do that. I'm slightly jealous now. So now you can see where kind of Matt comes from, basically when he's coming in with his opinions. And with that, it is time to get Matt's hot take on Hall of the Mountain Grill.
It's interesting in your setup that you mentioned that Hawkwind have a little bit more money to throw around for this album, because one of my slightly sniffy comments I wrote when I first started listening to this would be, what happens when you give Hawkwind money? It could be what this album sounds like, because I think on the whole, it's a good album. I do like it. For me, if I jump from the Do Re Mi to this and kind of don't deal too much with the space ritual, I can see it as a good jump. I think the clarity of it, which I have been going on some time about, is much better. You know, it feels like they're in a studio now rather than just like in a garage. So they do feel like more cohesive, which I feel like they kind of had to do if they're a band with increasing stature. You can't get away with sounding like you're just playing in your mum's basement the whole time. I'm going to back this up with a little bit of cursory research I did, where actually Simon King was very excited about the sound of Hall of the Mountain Grill. In an article, he actually said it sounded like Do Re Mi and Space Ritual. It sounded like the bass was turned off, your amp wasn't working properly, and your studio was bunged up at the same time. I wasn't really happy with either. So I was like, good, great, not just me. The drummer also thought that trying to listen to this sounded like you were trying to listen to a band through several feet of cotton wool. So the fact that everything is clear in this album is really, really nice. So as a first pass, just generally, I like the fact that it has improved in quality. What has changed for me a little bit is that I don't know now whether to take Hawkwind seriously or not with its content. When you first see the album, there's a big crash spaceship, really moody. There's some really nice, like foreshortening in there. You know, there are these kind of crashed tubes that you look like you're looking through in order to make a journey to this ship. But then it's also called Hall of the Mountain Grill, which as soon as you hear Hall of the Mountain, you want to add the word king, and they're like, psych, no, we're going to talk about like a greasy spoon that we used to hang out in, which is just weird and again for me completely incongruous with the art. And then the logo's changed again in this kind of like bubble writing, and then the album's written in cursive. So you know, I feel like when you look at it, there's a lack of cohesion now, where the sound has got more cohesive. The messaging for me has got kind of confusing. When I put it on, I wasn't quite sure what to expect. What I did get was raucous experimentation, some good fun energy, a couple of tracks which don't go quite where I want them to, and one or two where I'm like, how did you put that on an album? So I got what I wanted, and it feels like Do Re Mi plus. It was very apparent that they had either brought someone new in or had been practicing a lot, because I feel like musically and also just in terms of the tightness of a lot of this, it's a lot more professional. And I'm saying that while doing bunny ear quotes around it, you know, like it sounds a bit more together, which isn't always Hawkwind sound. So I do like the fact that they are still a bit jammy in there, but there's a couple of tracks which we'll get to where you suddenly feel like, did I put on the wrong record? Because it's suddenly so different. But there's a lot of raw emotion in here, which I do really like. Before we go track by track, the other thing that I thought when I listened to this is that if I was going to rename this album, I would probably rename it to Yes, We Really Like the Chords of Lord of Light as well. Because I think there's several tracks on here where I do feel like I can sing the Lord of Light lyrics over without having to change key at all. So there's something kind of futuristic and forward-looking in some of their tracks, and also somehow a bit like self-effacing and derivative, especially like the last track where they're using lyrics and themes from other albums and stuff, and almost to make it kind of like Kappa at the end of everything. So it's an interesting journey. Again, it's not something that is plain sailing. It certainly kept me on my toes, but there are some definite highlights in it that kept me listening, and again made the repeat listenings that I did very enjoyable.
That's interesting. I knew that the sound quality was going to be a major part of your experience of this album, and I totally hear where you're coming from. So let us delve into the track by track. And coming straight out of the box is the Psychedelic Warlords Disappear in Smoke, surely one of the greatest track titles of all time, and a pretty energetic start to the album, Matt.
Anyone who's listened to our introductory track before we started writing our own little FXE stings will hear this track, because that is the first thing I thought of when I heard this. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that. It's like that little bit that I threw on the start of the podcast, thinking that you made it on your Ableton setup before you were like, that's a real thing and we will get copyright strikes. So yes, we didn't do that afterwards. But yeah, so that was a nice take back
to where we came from.
Exactly. But yeah, as you said, the first thing you hear is that like searing electric synthy kind of growl that places you very much in the Hawkwind's world. And then from there, yeah, we kick into a really nice like guitar strum. You bring some delay into that. You halve the amount of strums and let the delay do the work. And before you know it, you're in an insanely groovy intro, which is really, really gorgeous. I was very happy with the way it starts, but also because it sounds so nice. You can just, again, hear the detail in the guitar. You can hear the detail in the delays. The bass is nodding along. I think the bass is only like a 3-note, just descending sequence, but it just works. All of this works. And I think the reason it works is because they've left a lot of space in the tracks and they're letting some of the effects work for them, where sometimes I feel like they want to try and plug any space in with the kind of the crazy like instrumentation babble. But this time they're like, nope, we're going to just be very simple about this, and the whole thing works. It had a solid groove, great energy. The lyrics I really like. It feels very classic-y Hawkwind. It has that slightly establishment feeling without going too off the rails in terms of fantasy. The disappear in smoke is a great insult. Just like, you can disappear in smoke, just sounds like the kind of thing that a Victorian gentleman might shout out of his carriage at some knave who just cut him off. I think I'm going to try and use that in future. And it's interesting when you think about that, because I was trying to think what disappear in smoke meant. It could either mean like you phase like out of existence in a kind of creepy way, or like a ninja where you smoke bomb. But because I feel like it's talking about people they don't like, the idea of disappear in smoke, I was wondering if it was like a very veiled idea of like an explosion or something. Because I guess if you were in a house and you blew up a house or something, you would effectively disappear in smoke. And I thought that was quite an artistic way of potentially a more violent threat than we've heard from Hawkwind.
It is, I think, quite a kind of an angry, at least a frustrated lyric. As actually Brock's lyrics in his tracks are throughout the album. There's a lot of frustration in the tracks that he writes. But I'm going to read a little passage, as I tend to do, from Joe's book, basically, that talks to this. So he says, quote, "There is an undercurrent of unrest and edge, and so the sound surges and swells. Brock delivers an unambiguously angry lyric. Sick of politicians, harassment and laws, all we do is get screwed up by other people's flaws. Always implicitly anti-authoritarian, always critical of straight society, this nevertheless feels newly militant. That opening couplet, plus a later reference to concrete jungles, feels like it's tapping directly into the particular political turbulence around them. To me, there's always been two modes of Hawkwind. There's the one where they are doing pure cosmic space stuff, the science fiction element, and there's the kind of social issues tracks that they tend to write. Time We Left This World Today is a good example of that. There's way more to come. And sometimes they'll do the social message through the science fiction. But this is straight down the line, frustration, current events kind of a thing. And I really like it. It's a stronger voice from Dave Brock than we've heard before either.
It's interesting because some of their tracks where you feel like they've been anti-stuff, their vocal delivery has been a lot more raw. Like Time We Left This World Today is a sneering, rasping, guttural way of singing and chanting. But this is actually very harmonic and well sung. And there's two of them singing in a kind of harmony. So it felt like they are angry, but the anger is almost transcendent of the the violence, which is why I feel like the idea of like disappearing smoke feels more like almost a Dr. Manhattan level of calm as he zaps people rather than someone in the trenches throwing Molotovs and stuff. So it was interesting. It was interesting to hear the content mixed with the way that they deliver it. That said, the drums are just a clattering, pounding force all the way through this, and the fills are very satisfying as well, especially because you can pick them out from everything you've heard before. So I think that's very satisfying. Even when they drop into the midway little like down tempo bit where everything breaks down and they play some jazz stuff, that jazz stuff is so clear that I was really happy. I was like, okay, Hawkwind, you can have this one. Your little sax noodle sounds really good now. And it's not just in the background in the corner being told to just like whittle around for a little bit and then we'll ignore you some more. This is there. And again, that energy and that frustration seems to come through the horn as well. So it's interesting that the lyrics are almost the least aggressive part of it in terms of its delivery, even if its content is a little bit more like subversive.
Yeah, agreed. I only ever saw this track played live by Hawkwind once, which is a shame given it's one of my favourites. But they played it at the Town and Country Club, which is now the Forum in Kentish Town. And that riff just came through with such power. So yeah, wish they would add that back into the set list.
There is a little bit of recurring mysticism that we do see in the lyrics, where they do say the word seven a lot again, a little bit like the 7x7. They talk about 7 different highs and that kind of thing. So it's nice to know that even when this comes in as a track and it's like, this is our track that we're putting out first, this is going to be our big energetic piece, there is still that call back to, but this is who we are and this is what we believe. And, there is still some mysticism and stuff in here. Yeah, it's called the Psychedelic Warlords, but at the same time, the use of 7 in there was kind of a bit of a comfort blanket in a way. It's kind of like, oh, they're angry, but they're talking about 7, so we're okay. This is nice.
Yeah, no, good shout. And that leads us into Wind of Change, which I think we can both agree is markedly superior to the Scorpions track of the same name.
It's crazy, this track, as not just an abrupt change in style after the first track, but for it to be on the album at all. I remember the first time I did listen to this album, I was walking my dog. It was late at night, and I listened to the first track and was like, oh, this will be fun, we'll have a brisk walk to this. And then that second track came on, and I found myself walking along the piers of Dumbo with maybe like 2 or 3 other people around, lit up by just little pier lights. I could almost see the Statue of Liberty, and it was strangely compelling just to sit down on the grass and look at the Manhattan skyline in front of me and just listen to this and be suddenly aware of myself and life and everything. It felt like a strange like soundtrack to a time when you just like have a bit of a moment where you wake up to yourself. So that was really weird. So the first time that happened was kind of crazy. It's very emotional. It has a lot of feeling to it. It has a great blend of more synthy, growly sounds at the beginning, but then this kind of orchestral part comes in, which doesn't soften it, but just so much as just adds layers to it, and the whole thing kind of undulates and gets very wistful and contemplative. I feel like if the ship from the album cover was falling to earth as it had some kind of terrible malfunction and ends up just embedding itself in the sea like you see, if they played this while it was falling down, that would be a crazy cinematic moment, and that's kind of what I had in my head. The thing which is weird for me on this is that around the 3:20 mark, when the violin really starts to get into its main theme, that's when I got this kind of click in my head, and I was like, is this Lord of Light? Because it really feels like if you hum the Lord of Light lyrics over this track, I swear it absolutely hits. It was so odd where I felt like, oh, this feels like this could be a reprise to Lord of Light, but they've called it Wind of Change, which is fine. But yeah, it was oddly then familiar, and that slightly took me out of it as soon as I realised that, because I felt like we've heard of Lord of Light, that's cool. Hawkwind are very much about going forward, so I don't know if they just like those chords or whether or not maybe I'm mishearing it, but I'd like anyone who's listening to this to listen to it again with that in mind and see whether or not they get the same vibe that I do from it.
That would be interesting. Do let us know, and get used to that, Matt, because they go through a period in future years of re-recording old songs in their entirety.
Which is fine because then you're doing that. But if you take a little bit of a song that you've already made, call it something else, and try and get away with it, I'm surprised. Which I'm not dinging them on that massively, but because it's such a lovely track, and it is so different, and it's a great direction for Hawkwind to go, and they pull it off massively. I was just like surprised that it felt as familiar as it did, considering that the first like 3 minutes don't. So as soon as it breaks into this, I was like, oh, okay, that's surprising.
Perhaps it's just like a kind of a rich territory for them, and they think they can reinterpret it in different contexts. It's definitely one I got that I do tend to lose myself in whenever I'm playing this album.
Yeah, it's quite lovely. I mean, it's difficult to describe it, which is weird, when you're doing a review podcast, but the amount of new instruments in this is really interesting. Like, we haven't really heard violins from Hawkwind. We haven't heard this mellotron. We haven't heard really orchestral sounds. So the drama in this was massively surprising and did feel like, again, when you're looking for like the what's the thing in the album that they haven't done yet, which makes you feel like Hawkwind is still pushing, this is a great example of it.
Yeah, very much so. And although this is a Dave Brock track, all of the things that you just mentioned feel like Simon House additions to this band.
This is the one as well that I was going to say feels the most tight, where it's not a jammy track. It's much more of a symphonic track, and symphonic tracks need to be tight, because if you tried to play that loose, it would fall apart and it would lose its drama, because everything coming together on the one is really important. So I felt like, yeah, they've been in the rehearsing studio for a while, because all of this was really on beat and really tight and really nice. And in other tracks, they get to be a bit shuffly again, which is fine because that's appropriate for the music. The fact that they can do this was nice to hear,
Yeah, totally. And I think they might be about to get a little shuffly with the Nick Turner track on the album, D-Rider.
Which is a track which I really like. This track is like, when it comes on after Winds of Change, it's a nice track to come on afterwards, because again, the kind of windy whooshy thing trailing off at the end of Wind of Change, and then this coming in is a great little audio segue. Again, I like the little, like the choppy guitar. The bass sounds great. I know before, I think an album or two ago, I was saying that I felt like just the tone of the bass was wrong. The bass in this sounds like bass, but again, not like a big growly subby bass or anything. It's still there as a note, but it sounds like it works for some reason. Maybe it's just because the audio quality is different now, but the extra low-end guitar in here plays notes which are super complementary. You can hear them like working in between each other, which is really nice. It's just, again, it's got a lovely groove to it when it first starts. The vocals for me are something else. They're so oddly angelic-y, kind of, they're higher than normal. I really like the sound of them, actually. I do think they're great. They have a little bit of that drama sound from the 7x7 and like the Sonic Attack, kind of the way that guy reads the prose. It has a bit of this in it because it goes up and down several octaves, and it has like little turns of phrases which are really nice. It sounds for me like a War of the Worlds track or something.
Yeah.
It has this strange like production to it where it doesn't sound as raw as Hawkwind normally does, and maybe that's something that they've lost a little bit in their sound transition, where it almost sounds a bit too produced sometimes with this. Like, because the first track is more like them being them.
Yeah.
Then you have Wind of Change, and then this is kind of like what happens if you squidge the two a little bit and just put a little bit of that production into a Hawkwind song.
It's interesting how Nick, as you say, doing the vocals, how dramatically different this is from the other big Nick vocal that we've heard before, which of course is Brainstorm, which had the punk, the aggressive, the Johnny Rotten vibe to it. It kind of really does show that the guy's got some range.
Massively. And the lyrical content I really like as well. Like, the choruses are great. I love spacing out by spacing in, turning up by burning out, lifting off and gazing in.
Yeah.
I like the interplay between that. Conceptually, I like this song. I feel like it's got a nice idea to it. So I vibe with not only the way it's delivered. I love spacing out by spacing in. Just for me, I would swap Hall of the Mountain Grill out and put that on an album title and just like bang, sold. I think the way that the chorus is delivered has a little bit too much phase effect on it. It took a while for me to realize that's what they were saying, but when I figured that's what they were doing, I was like, oh, I really like that. But yeah, that phase is a little much, but it is nice as a way of going into something more interesting for the chorus. So I like the idea, even if the execution is just a little bit maybe up to 11 when they could have backed it off a touch. But again, the orchestral feeling is in this track. You know, there is that behind them. There are these very stringy, choiry kind of sounds, which again just help glue the whole track together.
Absolutely agree. And it's, for me, it's like there are two big musical statements on side one of this album, and this is the second one, with Psychedelic Warlords being the first one. So yeah, completely with you on that.
There is a definite story going through this, which I still haven't quite figured out. They say, for example, the Earth was forming from below. So I'm wondering, does that mean, because the first thing they talk about is like almost like being kids. It's almost like a callback to Children of the Sun somehow. Like, you know, we were young, we were innocent. When we talk about the Earth forming from below, I was wondering if that meant like as they were exploring from a low vantage point, it looked like the Earth was forming in the same way that, you know, you just see more of it as it comes, or whether or not they're in space and the Earth is literally forming. But then they talk about their mother, maybe their mother's also in space, but they also say a dragon told them where to go, and also they forge rings. So like suddenly there is fantastical elements, which is the first time I think I've really heard that in a Hawkwind track. So the story is there. It's kind of confusing. I'm not quite sure I get it, but the chorus is great, so I'm fine with it.
Cool. Which takes us to the final track on side one of this album, which is another Brock track, Webweaver.
A few seconds in, you feel like it's going to be crazy upbeat, and then it hits a minor chord, and I'm kind of relieved. So I'm like, okay, no, cool, right, we're where it should be. It's a strange track, considering how well constructed and considered Wind of Change and D-Rider are. I feel like this track is almost like they've been so, you know, like you tell a kid to just like sit for a little bit too long, and then you say you can go and play, and they just explode and just run all over the place because they've got all this energy. I kind of feel like Webweaver feels like Hawkwind's been told that they've had to be tight and musical all this time, and then they just explode and go, no, we'll make Webweaver. And it's like, suddenly it's like, and we're going to smash a piano that you've never heard before into one of our tracks, and it's going to like be really like upbeat, like You're Only Dreaming, in a familiar kind of vibe, and just be super upbeat, and like mix electronics and just like mix keyboards and just be strange. And the whole thing is quite chaotic sonically compared to the other track, and it's like, but it's so oddly upbeat despite being in a minor key that it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think when I was first hearing this album, when I was younger, I was drawn more to D-Rider as being songs with a structure I could follow and something which was identifiable as a chorus. These days, the weirder things get, the more I tend to like them, and Webweaver definitely qualifies. I'm very much more into it now, listening to the album, than I was when I was first listening to it all those years ago.
I was going to say, like, if this is your first Hawkwind album, and by the way, of all the Hawkwind albums that I've heard so far to start with, this is a good one.
Yeah.
If you get the first track, and then you got the Wind of Change one, which is crazy, then you have the third track, Derider, and then you get to Webweaver, did you feel the same kind of strange, like, handbrake turns sonically that I guess I have been feeling through a lot of these albums? Do you remember?
Yeah, I had no frame of reference through which to connect with Webweaver. And there's relatively few times in your life that happens. I remember the first time I ever heard Sun, for example. And you go, I have no idea how I'm supposed to... I loved it, and I got into it. But I didn't understand it at all. And Webweaver, to young me, was like, well, I didn't expect this. You know, what is going on here? And then you have to try and get into it and work it out kind of from the inside. I probably found that quite challenging when I was younger, but now the kind of picture kind of reveals itself a little bit more as you've got more things to bring to it from other music you've listened to. So yeah, now I really appreciate it.
That's a funny thing, isn't it? Like, the first bands you listen to, they'll do something that maybe you're not ready for, but because you haven't got a huge range of knowledge and they're a professional band that released something, you almost go, well, I guess they're right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally.
They're a band.
Yeah,
and
that's
they made
exactly
something.
it. That's exactly it.
So it is funny coming to this now, I guess for me, after listening to, you know, literally thousands of albums in my life, to listen to this and be like, well, you don't get a pass like that, so I'm going to judge you in a way. So, but I do feel like now I've learned more about what they're about, I was less offended by this track.
Yep.
Even so, I was like, it's fine. I don't think it's one I'm particularly listen to again, even if it is weird. I mean, it's interesting just because it has a piano in it, for sure. That again, that's a new bit of experimentation, which I appreciate.
Yeah, we've not had that before. So we flipped the record over and we put our needle on, and we are greeted with one of two live tracks. See, I don't know completely why they were live. I can only assume that maybe they tried to record them, but the live versions they had were just better and they cleaned them up, put them on. But nevertheless, this side of the record is bookended by two live tracks, the first of which is You'd Better Believe It.
Which I wonder whether or not, from a Hawkwind point of view, they wanted to do that just for their sound. Like, they couldn't let this Simon House guy just come in and ransack everything and say, we're going to be in a studio, and we're going to be electric, and we're going to be tight. They're like, yeah, but we also just want to jam, so that's also what we're going to do.
So you mean Simon listens to it and then says, look, here are all the overdubs that I'm going to change on this, and the band just go, nah.
Well, you can, but we're going over here. We're going to this grill. This track is fun. Again, it feels like a Hawkwind kind of track. But again, I feel like there's a little bit of whatever infected web weaver has crept into this a little bit. It's like, again, it's a strange new genre of space country. We've had other space versions of songs, and now we have this kind of, I don't know if it's a fiddle or like it is the violin or something, but like when I first heard this, I think I might have laughed a little bit because I wasn't expecting it. And it sounded a bit like it was going to be some kind of like space barn dance suddenly. But the track itself is quite rocky, you know, like it has a pounding like 4/4 beat to it. The vocals are cool. Is it Lemmy that just shouts "Better Believe It" like at the start of every chorus?
Yeah, that's Lemmy.
Yeah, it's so unmistakable, and it's like, it's fun. I feel like that could be a real crowd thing. Everyone going "Better Believe It."
Yeah, that happens.
It's good fun. Yeah. So it's fun. Again, part of the thing which is always strange about Hawkwind, that they've led with this track, which is very anti-establishment and the system's terrible, we're psychic crazy people, through back to this where it's just like, but we also just make music, which is what I feel like, a bit like the album, a bit like the songs. I always find trying to grab hold of Hawkwind and their values and what they actually mean is like trying to grab hold of soap in the bath. You know, like as soon as you feel like you've got a grip on it, they ping off somewhere and you have no idea where they're going to land. And it's fun and exasperating at the same time. Again, it kind of depends on whether or not I'm in vibe alert or detailed listening alert. So from a vibe, this is perfectly fine. It's good. It's a head nodder. It's a toe tapper. You know, like I also feel like I don't know what sound they use for their synth, but for me, I was like, that almost sounds like synth dog. It has this kind of like kind of sound to it, which again feels like great. We've got Space Country, we've got Space Dog. I'm not quite sure where this track is going. I think it sounds fine. It sounds good. It sounds a little silly to me, which is a shame because there's some nice bits to it. Like the Better Believe It chorus is really good. I enjoy that a lot.
Yeah, I like the lyrics in the verses, but yeah, no, I see where you're coming from. I like the energy in it. There's a lot of energy that runs through some of the tracks on this album. And again, as you said, there are these other areas where it almost goes into like a soundscape territory. They play off each other quite well. And actually, the next one is illustrative of that because The New Boy gets the title track, which is quite something. First title track Hawkwind have ever done.
I was surprised that this is the title track for the album because, again, it's quite short. It's very instrumental. Not very instrumental, it is instrumental, right? There's not a lyric in it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So, yeah, I was just kind of surprised that this is the one that they picked. I like it. Again, the piano, the synths, the instrumentation is glued nicely together by that flanger effect that keeps it, again, feeling very Hawkwindy and not just like any band could do it. So it feels like it's in the Hawkwind language. For me, it sounded like a Resident Evil track or something, like if you're exploring an evil forest or something. Again, if you look at the album art and play this track, you could feel like, compared to the idea of the Wind of Change idea, it's like it's less that you survived the crash and you're walking away and you turned for one last look at your fallen ship, which is kind of what I see it as if I hear Wind of Change and look at that album. If I look at this, it's more like you weren't expecting to find a ship, and this is what you've seen on your travel or on your journey. So suddenly it becomes a little bit more sinister, like, are there survivors? Is it dead? Is it haunted? Will it explode? Maybe there's treasure. You know, so there's There's a different vibe to it, but I do feel like it's got that kind of sinister-y, I'm exploring something maybe I shouldn't kind of feel to it. So I do feel like it's very evocative and moody. It's just funny how when it comes on I like it, and then afterwards I completely forget it's on the album. I think again because it's just not quite long enough to just get itself in my head like some of the other longer tracks which do.
No, I'm with you. I always like it when it comes on. It's probably not one that I'd point to and go, you have to hear this. But something about it means that, like, I never even think about skipping it. It comes along, it does its thing rather wonderfully, and then disappears again.
Yeah, I just feel for me it doesn't quite get into my head well enough in what it does. Probably if it was another minute longer,
Yeah.
then I probably would think about it more. But again, just because it's kind of in and out.
Yeah, it's very true. It does that thing where it does what it does nicely, and they decide not to take it anywhere else.
They've taken it longer than some of their other skits,
Yeah.
so I'll applaud it for that. I just hope in future that they do let these breathe a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And if I may be in charge of the segue for once, I do feel that one of the reasons why this gets pounded out of my head so quickly is because the next track, Lost Johnny, is so opposite.
Yeah, totally.
That it just means that it's very difficult to remember a nice delicate track because it's just pounded out of my head by one of the most formulaic is sounds rude, but you know what I mean. I listen to it, I just go like, it rolls, it has chord changes, it's a good rock track.
Yes.
You know, it sounds great, but it is not as advanced as like some of the other stuff they're doing. But I like it when Hawkwind get in this groove and like we're just going to do a good solid track. You just can't fault it really. It's Lemmy singing it, right?
It's Lemmy, and he co-wrote it, or at least the lyrics were co-written between him and a guy called Mick Farron. Basically, who had a band called the Deviants, and both Motorhead and the Deviants re-record this later on. So yes, this is a Lemmy track, and I think even without Lemmy singing it, you know it's a Lemmy track.
Yeah, it has very pleasing chord progressions.
Yeah.
You know, like the way it hits up, down, like when they hit, you're just like, yeah. And it's good, yeah, it's got a good roll through the whole thing. My first note that I wrote after being able to decipher all the lyrics was Hawkwind's Eleanor Rigby ?
I had never thought of that, I have to admit.
It's just like, you know, it's telling stories about people who are like not doing very well, which is what I feel like the Eleanor Rigby song's all about. This is like the Hawkwind version where someone needs speed and Vicodin and stuff really quickly. So it's like, okay, well, the Beatles wouldn't sing that, but you know, but they're still having a hard time.
If Ellen Rigby and Father Mackenzie had been massive drug addicts, then yes, this would really work.
It's funny though, the lyrics, because some of the lyrics are they're dark and they're kind of grungy, but also they're a little bit kind of prudish in a way, or just like more beating around the bush than you'd expect. Like they talk about the lady who gets underwear from places no one goes and then makes her money by showing what she shows or something like that. And it's like, okay, so you're not going to say she's a stripper or she takes bad photographs. You're going to say that in a very like suggestive way.
Yes.
But you're also going to say, has anyone got some pills? Because this guy's about to shoot some people.
Yes, it is. It's curiously mixed up.
It's that kind of strange, like, censored for America, you know, where they're like, you know, you can blow someone's face off with a shotgun on TV, but you can't show a bra.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It felt like the lyrical version of this.
I hear what you're saying. It's definitely kind of feels like this track just drops in like a brick into the middle of this record. Like there's all of the, you know, the violins and the mellotrons and the piano and the big swooshy noises behind things and the kind of soundscape. And then this appears. I always enjoy listening to it, but it always kind of takes me out of the kind of dreamy state that Hawkwind puts me in and takes me somewhere different entirely. And then the next thing kind of brings me back again with this. But so yeah, I've kind of got into it, and I do like it. Obviously, it's Lemmy. How can you not? He's got such a voice, hasn't he, and such a presence.
Yeah. Which again, I feel like might be the playlist thing that we talked about at the start of this talk, that if you put this in with some other tracks, you can curate the mood that you want Hawkwind to put you in.
Yeah.
I feel like that's one of the problems with their albums a little bit, is that the more experimental they are, they're still bringing with them their space rock vibe that they obviously don't want to lose, and they obviously do it very well. But then if they want to progress into more like interesting dreamy stuff, they don't want to leave it behind. They're not releasing 2 albums a year, so what do? They have to kind of put all of it together. So it is that kind of interesting thing where they've made a 3-course meal, but they put it on one plate, and now you have to try to pick out the bits you want. Otherwise, you might suddenly find there's some blancmange in your steak, or, and that's the issue that they have by being such a versatile band, I guess.
Yeah. And having so many inputs. I mean, Dave Brock does sometimes dominate the songwriting, but they clearly take input from pretty much everybody who's in the room.
Lemmy will produce this kind of track, as we know.
Exactly.
They let him have a crack, and this is what he's made, which is cool. But yes, incongruous with some of the other stuff.
Yeah. And we go to Goat Willow, which is Del Detmar, and Del's had a few of these on previous albums where he gets like a minute and a half of just kind of noodling that they obviously like enough to stick on the album without turning them into full-blown songs.
Yeah, I think this is twice as long as the last one that we talked about.
Yeah.
It's very quote-unquote ambient for Hawkwind, as in the genre of ambience. It reminds me more of a Brian Eno or a Ryuichi Sakamoto kind of song over just them doing their kind of space noodling, which they do before a track. So it feels like there's this strange embryonic development every album where this kind of thing from them gets a little bit further, a little bit more complex, and a little bit more like what it might be. So I'm really looking forward to about 6 albums time when maybe this gets to become a track.
Well, it might do, but of course Del leaves at the end of this album, so probably not.
No, I'm not surprised. If I only got 1.5 minutes to do my ambient thing, I might leave too.
And that takes us into the closer, another live one, Paradox.
So this for me is the second Lord of Light chords track, which again, this one, because there's actually vocals in it, this is for me very like Lord of Light, the remix or the reinterpretation, that if you hum Lord of Light over it, you get that. Just again, because I feel like to do it once, fine. To do it twice, I'm feeling a bit like this is regressive for Hawkwind. And yeah, it sounds great. They've obviously hit a progression and a melody that does work, but it does feel a little lazy considering what I know the band is capable of. It feels like a wrap-up track. They sing the lyrics, "See it as you really are," which sounds like, "Seeing it as you really are" in the other album. So I feel like it's almost like a coda for the previous 2 albums, where they're like, this is what we sounded like, this is cool. I wonder whether or not it's like a swan song, whether or not they're trying to put that to bed. It'd be interesting to know where they go from here, whether or not they're like, this is a departure track, or whether or not it's just what they wanted to do. This one's a little bit of a puzzle for me. Like, I guess when you first heard it, you wouldn't have heard Lord of Light.
No, I didn't hear Lord of Light till quite some time later.
So do you think Lord of Light sounds like this? Or again, am I just...
I hadn't really made the connection. I can see the connection with the earlier track, but I've listened to them separately so much that I've probably just divided them in my head. With this one, I don't feel it quite so much. That's not to say it's not there. It's just the way that track settled in my head now.
Yeah, that's fair. That's just, it'd be interesting to see if anyone else agrees. This is probably the one where I have less to say, just because it feels very familiar, so I felt like I'd just be treading old ground.
It's Hawkwind being kind of having something that's very recognisably something that they have done before, just in terms of feel and structure. They're not experimenting on this track particularly. I do like, again, there's this kind of angry frustration in the lyrics that Brock is singing. This kind of, always, it's the same thing, you just can't win. All of this, that all comes across this kind of frustrated negativity, which I'd always thought, but which it was interesting. Joe talks about this in his book, and it always kind of gives you a sense of, yes, I was right about that when you see someone else say it. Because I'd always thought that this sounded like a period of Dave's life where he was pretty hacked off about something or other. I think even the same is true of the other track. You Better Believe It. There's a similar frustration, I think, in the lyrics to that. It has an energy to it born of that kind of frustration, I find. Obviously, it goes into its kind of mellowy bit.
Which is interesting, because I feel like the first track in that style is like, the first track is angry, the last track is disappointed. It has a different energy to it. I made a note about this, and now you've said that, it feels like it makes more sense. I was feeling like this track feels like an exhalation. It's a sigh.
It's resignation, isn't it? Always the same thing. You just can't win. Yeah, you're right. It's a resignation.
It's Hawkwind's lament. Everything's on a down.
Yeah, which is really interesting because I haven't come across that before. You know, they've had a lot of dystopian songs, but yeah, never had quite that feeling in it. And I wonder how much of that is born of just what was happening in their lives at the time.
Yeah, because it's weird because like in dystopian songs and films and literature, there's almost a glee in it.
Yes,
you know.
Yes, exactly.
There's a glee in dystopia where like either there are no rules or everything's broken down and it's kind of great, or it's terrible but also it's thrilling. This is like there's a dystopia and it sucks.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. Actually, this is one of my favourite tracks on the album, but mainly for that verse and the riff that accompanies that opening verse. I do love that. So that is Hall of the Mountain Grill, the music. Let's check out the cover art. So the front cover to this is another Barney Bubbles creation. So he is brought back in again, but it's not got the whole album to play with this time because the back cover is a painting by David A. Hardy. I know this appealed to me massively when this came my way because of the science fiction books I was reading at the time. I think my brother may have tapped into that, or he may have just trawled the H section at the local Woolworths, given that he also got me Jimi Hendrix. But yeah, I do very much like both the front and back cover of this.
The front is deceptively complex. I think the first time I looked at it, I guess as a thumbnail, I was like, what the hell is that? And then I looked at it again and it's really nice. It looks like it's sprayed maybe, or there's like that kind of spray pen that Geiger used.
That's why I figured it looked like the cover of a science fiction book, because all of those were intended to be spray painted.
But the one thing that's interesting about this is that it's actually a study of circles. Like the whole thing is almost 100% made up of circles. Mm-hmm. You have that lovely foreshortening where you feel like you're looking through the skeletal remains of a tube of the ship, which focuses your eye to where the ship has crashed. But even then, they are these kind of ribs, these like circular parentheses that are put into what looks like the sea. The ship itself is made up of circles. There are these portholes. The first thing you see is like, even though the body of the ship is at an angle, it's all circles. The thruster at the top is a sphere. The kind of little like winglet jet tubes are all circular. Even like the actual bit, even though it looks like it's an angle, the bit that you can see which is opening where it's made contact with the sea is a circle. The new Hawkwind logo is a cloud which looks like lots of little circles. Even I guess the cursive of the record title itself is all very organic and swirly. So it's interesting to see that there's a clear theme with this. Even I guess the sun in the background, again a big crescent sphere. So again, like when you first look at it, you're like, oh, it's a ship. But when you start to really look at it, you can see that there's a lot of work has gone into it. There is this interesting circular theme through it. And again, the lines, the kind of striations of the sea, which just cut up the lower quarter of the label, actually then form a stark contrast to all the circles. So there's an interesting like harmony, but then at the end where there's been this crash, I like the fact that there's this kind of dissonance of shapes where the circular harmony has literally hit the straight lines of the ground, and then that kind of gives you this feeling of impact. Even though this ship looks decrepit and really old, it looks like you can still feel the impact of the ship as it fell.
Yeah, it's very atmospheric. It's going back to your vibe process. It's very much one that you can just kind of stare at while listening to the music, particularly the more ambient stuff on the album, and kind of be drawn into it for sure, which is absolutely what I did basically when I was younger. Actually, for many years, I had a massive, like a A1 or something, poster of this on my wall. So, yeah, do love this. I have no idea what happened to that poster, but yeah, I do love this. And also, I think the same is true. You can really get lost in that painting on the back cover as well.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know if this is another part of the planet, or whether or not it's, you know, like a nice thing that they've made. Like, it would be interesting to see the difference, because the front cover is all greys and very dark colours. It all looks very muddy. There even looks like some reeds or something like falling off the ship, like when Yoda brings the X-Wing out of the swamp and it's covered in stuff. It kind of looks like it has that same kind of swamp stuff on it, where the other side looks much more idyllic and nice. It feels like you climb the top of the hill and you're looking behind you and you're seeing this kind of alien landscape, obviously, because the sky is a dusty gold and the mountains are a cosmic purple. But the colours are very pleasing and it feels a lot more meditative and contemplative compared to the tragic mechanized disaster which has happened on the front, which is much more human or someone's endeavor and construction, where there isn't a hint of human or any other alien life on the back. It's just kind of has a isolated sereneness to it.
Yeah, very much so. And such a different vibe from the previous 2 or 3 album covers, which have been kind of very heavy on these kind of very in your face symbols, and kind of arcane things going on, and almost kind of codes, if you like, with some of the things going on Barney's exceptionally complex 6-fold out covers and things like this, and jigsaw covers and whatever. This seems to be simpler as a concept, but really draws you in.
It would be interesting to know the story of the ship, because it has what appears to be a Hawkwind logo on it. So whether or not this is a depiction of Hawkwind being smashed and falling apart, or whether or not it's like symbolic of them going through hard times,
or if it's the 2-dimensional spaceship from the logbook.
Yeah, but the fact it's crashed, and not soaring majestically through the sky, we knew that they were running out of everything.
Yeah.
So I guess they ran out of fuel finally, like they said they would, ran smack into a planet. So, it's interesting that the stuff that Hawkwind talk about in that kind of thematic world is that they talk about space and cosmos and craziness, but then they also talk about this ship, which is getting increasingly screwed as it goes in its journey. It's interesting that this might be its final resting place.
It may well. Time will tell. So that is Hall of the Mountain Grill, the album. It's been a great one to go through, and the track by track and the fantastic cover art. We will now begin to draw some conclusions and see what everybody else thought. So we want to see what other people thought of this, basically, and play against some of the conclusions that we drew. One person who I can say liked it very much was Lemmy, who commented in 2006, "For me, this was when the band were at their height. Oh, and I was in the band at the time." He listed this album as number 3 in his top British rock albums, which, given how startlingly different this is from Motorhead itself, that's pretty good. And shows maybe in amongst all the turmoil, there were some people having a pretty good time. Although, given the amount of drugs involved in Lost Johnny, maybe he was having a really good time. So we refer, as always, as our Bible of fan opinion, to Hawkwind Fans Worldwide Facebook Top 40 Albums by Elric Newby. And I have a new copy of this book because a version 2 of this book has been released. It is twice as thick as the old version, and the copy is the same size, which means there is a lot more content in this book than there was in the last one. More polls, more opinions, more comments. So, yep, very worthwhile. Got mine on Amazon. Buy it while stocks last. And it shows us that Hall of the Mountain Grill comes in at number 5 in the top 40. And if you take out Space Ritual as being a live album, we're just doing the studios, then it's a net 4, which is pretty good. I'll remind you that the ones above it, or 2 of the ones above it, are, of course, Space Ritual, and no, we haven't got to the others. So Space Ritual's above it, and I'm not telling you what the other ones are. We have not covered a studio album that charts higher than this.
Which doesn't surprise me, considering what we listen to, I guess. Like, I think there's some real great tracks on here, even if, again, maybe not every single one of them is a solid 10 out of 10. There's a lot of stuff in here to like, so it makes sense to me. Plus, I do feel like the change in audio really helps.
Yeah, this seems like, from everything that we've talked about, it sounds like you've had that this has been your most pleasing experience of listening to a Hawkwind album many, many times.
Yeah, I think Do Re Mi wasn't bad,
Mm-hmm.
but there are a couple of things that irritated me with it, which we talked about. This one I have far fewer gripes with. You know, there are some tracks which I think are fine, but I don't dislike.
Yeah.
I think probably Webweaver is the only one which I would consider maybe skipping. The rest of them I'm quite happy to listen all the way through. So for me, it's probably the most complete album that I've listened to from them.
Right. And given I remember that you liked Do Re Mi like a lot, the experience of when we were going through that, you were very keen on that album. Would you say that that's still your number one Hawkwind album, or has it been displaced as the one to beat?
That is a good question. I would say this is probably,
It's obviously too close to call. These things are so subjective, but it's interesting that it's up there. They're up there together.
I would say probably. I think Do Re Mi. I think probably has more tracks on it that I like.
Yeah.
I like this as an album more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally does. It totally does. So we have two playlists. We have the Hawkbinge Sessions playlist, which obviously has a couple of tracks from each of the Hawkwind albums we listen to, plus the tracks that we've been having on our turntable in between. We're starting a new one of those. The existing one is up there for you all to enjoy. So, Matt, which tracks from this album would you put on the Sessions playlist?
The tracks that I'll put on the Sessions playlist first is definitely D-Rider. I think the production is excellent. I think the song is both complex and groovy. I just like conceptually the lyrics. I find them visually and conceptually interesting. I think the singing's well done and evocative. I think it's a very tight journey. There's no time where it wanders off into craziness. It does what it needs to do, tells an interesting story, puts an interesting thought in my mind, and then is away and makes me feel like I want to listen to it again. So that for me is a really great track.
And if we were picking another one for the Sessions?
It's got to be the Psychedelic Warlords. I think that first track is a solid gold intro. It's going to be the one that reminds me the first time I heard, I guess, like Hawkwind in HD. There is an emotional connection for me as well, but it's just lucky as well that it just happens to be a really great track with a really great groove to it. It has the Hawkwind craziness in it, but in a way which is controlled and measured and nice. So I also like it for that. So it feels like it's got both sides of Hawkwind to it. So yeah, both of those tracks are just great for me.
Well, I'm glad that you said Psychedelic Warlords, because obviously if you hadn't, then I would have been going. And if you were picking a third track for the session, and so on, and so on. So we got there. No, that's good. That's good, because that would definitely be my pick. So obviously D-Rider is the one that's going to go onto the master playlist. So that's great. We've got those. And where can we find those playlists, Matt?
Those playlists can be found on Spotify. If you put Hawkbinge into Spotify or Hawkbinge Sessions, they will come up. They're pretty much the only thing that will come up. They will also be linked into the description of this podcast. And if you're listening to it on YouTube, you can go down and find all those lovely links below the video.
Fantastic. And if anybody wants to contact us to tell us how wrong we are about Hall of the Mountain Grill and many other things, where can they do that?
If they think we're really, really wrong, they can contact us at bingehawk.goaway.no. But if they really like us and want to send us some really awesome stuff, we are at Hawkbinge, both on Twitter and Instagram. And if you'd like to send us a longer form message, which we do read and always enjoy, then we are podcast at hawkbinge.space for emails. And I always forget, we are also on YouTube. Anyone who wants to check us out on YouTube, if you put Hawkbinge into YouTube, you will find us. We are pretty much the only thing that comes up. I do normally put this out a day or two afterwards, because I do try and fade up any images that we're talking about to make the video a bit more interesting. But if you do like listening to podcasts long form on YouTube, we are also now there.
Fantastic. Well, I've got to say, it's been much fun getting back into the Hawkbinge cockpit again and listening to this album, going through this particular album, given its relevance to me. So that's great. For now, it is time for these two particular Psychedelic Warlords to disappear in smoke. We will see you next time at the end of time.